July 10, 1918. Cruising off the southern tip of Ireland, lookouts aboard the US submarine L2 spotted what they believed was simply a buoy floating off Fastnet Rock. That is, until their captain, Paul F. Foster, upon closer inspection realized that they had stumbled across an Imperial German naval U-boat, specifically UB-65. Springing into action, the American crew were preparing a torpedo attack, when suddenly, the U-boat was engulfed in what appeared to be an underwater explosion, which consumed the narrow shark-like hull of the enemy submarine. Quickly, it disappeared beneath the waves, denying Foster and his crew the credit for the U-boat's destruction. But unknowingly to him or any of his men, their witnessing of this event would bookend a mystery that has divided military historians and paranormal researchers for decades. For UB-65 had a reputation as a cursed submarine, and one in which death was seemingly no guarantee of escape for the poor souls aboard. Its mysterious demise, apparently witnessed by Foster and his men, has only cemented the story of UB-65's curse, and whose crew it is said feared the spirit of a deceased former officer much more than they did the Allied warships which hunted them in the cold depths during World War I. In this episode, we are going to take a look at the real wartime service of UB-65 and investigate this legend to establish if there really is any truth in the story of the supposedly haunted U-boat, or whether it was, as some believe, the result of an elaborate plan by the Allies to combat the underwater menace. Welcome to Wars of the World. The UB-65 story begins in 1916 as German engineers looked to build a new type of coastal attack submarine. At the time, the type UB-2 attack boat was the primary class in this role, but upon realizing the superior qualities of the type UC-2 mine-laying submarine, they decided to instead adapt this design into a new torpedo U-boat to replace them, designated as the type UB-3. The Imperial German Navy had some grand plans for the new class, with 201 examples being penned, but in the end only 96 would be completed in a 2-year-long production run. On the surface, the UB-3 displaced up to 555 tons, this increasing to 684 tons when submerged, and were 55.3 meters long, had a beam of 5.76 meters and a draft of 3.67 meters. On the surface, they were powered by 6-cylinder diesel engines, which produced over 1,045 horsepower, giving a maximum speed just shy of 14 knots, switching to 580 kilowatt electric motors when submerged, which could propel it along at up to 8 knots. Very respectable figures for a submarine of this era. Range was in excess of 7,000 nautical miles on the surface, while submerged on electric motors, range was between 50 and 55 miles, while cruising at an economic speed of 4 knots. On the business end of things, the main armament came in the form of 4 bow torpedo tubes and 1 stern tube. A typical loadout comprising 10 50cm or 19.7-inch torpedoes. These were backed up with an 88mm or 3.5-inch deck gun for combat on the surface. The first batch of Type UB-3s were ordered on May 20th, 1916, beginning with UB-48 and ending with UB-71. Included in this order was of course UB-65, which was constructed at the Fulkenwerke shipyard in Hamburg, the U-boat being completed and launched on June 26, 1917, before being commissioned into naval service on August 18th of that year. Command was given to 29-year-old Kapitan Lieutenant Martin Scheller, who had already made a name for himself as a competent U-boat commander, having already accrued an impressive tally of 33 Allied vessels sunk or damaged, mostly through the deployment of mines, while commanding the Type UC-2 U-boat, UC-33. It's at this time, according to the popular telling of the story of UB-65, that the sub began to rack up a body count already, even without having gone to sea yet. Its delivery to the Navy came with reports of at least one workman being killed, and one more seriously injured by a falling girder whilst under construction at the Wilkins yard. An accident which followed later was perhaps even more alarming for the men who were to crew the new U-boat. While working in the engine room as the sub neared completion, 3 workmen became overwhelmed by fumes accumulating in the compartment. Not having seen them for quite some time, their colleagues went looking for them to check in on them and found the 3 men dead, slumped on the floor of the engine room having been asphyxiated. But death wouldn't be satisfied with just taking those unfortunate to be assigned to help build UB-65. Upon completion, the sub was undertaking sea trials when it hit bad weather. U-boats were notoriously bad seakeepers on the surface, even under the best weather, and so as the weather deteriorated, the crew braced for a rough ride. Suddenly, the low-sitting craft became engulfed in a powerful wave which seemingly struck out of nowhere and without warning. As the water drained off the U-boat's hull and relieved the battered crewmen up on the deck, they found their number was 1 short, and the unfortunate man washed overboard would never be seen again. He became the 5th man to die associated with UB-65. As if this were not enough death to surround one vessel, during a test dive, it seemed as though the cursed U-boat would be sending its entire crew to the grave. As the crew attempted to level out at 30 feet, a forward ballast tank ruptured, sending the U-boat plummeting alarmingly to the seabed. Settling on the bottom, UB-65 remained stuck there for 12 hours as the crew fought to bring it back to the surface, their plight made all the more desperate and frightening as floodwater seeped into the batteries. This resulted in the release of toxic fumes which spread among the interior, making men violently ill. It therefore came as an enormous relief when, after a Herculean effort, they succeeded in forcing the U-boat to the surface, allowing them to open the hatches and breathe fresh, clean air. But sadly for 2 of the crew, it was too late, and they died in hospital several days later from inhaling the poisonous fumes. However, it was another tragic death that, as the story goes, would have a lasting impact on the crew. While torpedoes were being loaded for UB-65's first patrol, a warhead exploded, killing the 2nd officer named Richter, and 8 other seamen, as well as seriously wounding 9 other sailors. Then the U-boat was under tow back to dry dock for repair. A hysterical sailor reported that he had seen the ghost of Richter, his arms folded as he stood on the prow. UB-65 was now a haunted vessel, but despite the feeling of unease, possibly even impending doom among Scheller's crew, they had little time to dwell on it. Germany was getting desperate, and it needed its U-boats in the fight. Neither ghosts nor curses would stand in the way of UB-65 going to war. Upon entering service with the Imperial German Navy, UB-65, under the command of Scheller, joined UB Flotilla 5 and began operations around the British Isles, hoping to strangle Britain into submission by denying it vital war materials from abroad and preventing the shipment of men and weapons to France and Belgium, where now large numbers of American troops were also being embroiled. October 1917 brought with it a new offensive in the Ypres salient, remembered as the Second Battle of Passchendaele. This was joined by another offensive by the British Empire forces in Gaza against Germany's Ottoman allies. Against this backdrop, Scheller and UB-65 were sent to sea, hoping to do their part to affect the situation on land in Germany's favour. Rather ominously, given the U-boat's place in paranormal lore, on October 31st, 1917, Hallows Eve, Scheller spied the site of its first victim as he patrolled the North Sea, almost halfway between Norway and the Shetland Islands off of the north coast of Scotland. His target was the 20-year-old Danish freighter Margrethe, travelling from Copenhagen to Lerwick in the aforementioned islands. Scheller made his attack, but failed to sink the 1,277-ton steamer, the damaged vessel managing instead to limp to safety. The Margrethe would later be repaired and returned to service, only to then get captured by the crew of UC-59. Later, on December 12, 1917, Scheller and his men came across the Belleville, a 40-year-old Swedish-flagged sailing vessel in the Irish Sea. Scheller had his men board the vessel, and after the crew were taken off, they scuttled it, making the unfortunate vessel the UB-65's first successful sinking. Scheller would have more successes later that day when he spotted the 1,866-ton steamer Charleston carrying a consignment of coal bound for Bearhaven in Canada. Scheller attacked and sank the ship and even took 2 naval gunners who were aboard prisoner. December 1917 would prove a good month for Scheller, as on the 14th he sank another vessel in the Irish Sea, the Norwegian steamer Nor. Then the next day, he again spotted another target sailing through the Irish Sea, although this one was no ordinary steamer, for it was in fact HMS Arbutus, an Anchusa-class Q-ship which were designed to mimic regular civilian steamers in the hope of luring in unsuspecting U-boats, looking to inspect the vessel's cargo, or even capture it as a war prize. Once lured in, the Q-ship's crew could then reveal their concealed weapon and turn them on the U-boat. Exact details of the engagement between UB-65 and the Arbutus are hard to come by, but in this case, it was the UB-65 which would have the upper hand. Arbutus was hit and heavily damaged, but remained afloat as Scheller made good his escape. However, the next day whilst under tow, Arbutus sank, thus affording the U-boat another victory. It would not be until the following spring that UB-65 would return to the fray, sinking the Norwegian freighter Havner 20 miles southeast of Tusker Rock off the coast of County Wexford in Southern Ireland. Then there followed a string of attacks which only succeeded in damaging Allied shipping, until on May 8, 1918, Scheller stopped and scuttled the Norwegian sailing vessel Toralf, again in its usual hunting grounds of the Irish Sea. On July 10, 1918, UB-65 was spotted by the US submarine L2, where apparently it blew up. However, post-war research has proven this was incorrect, for the U-boat is now known to have still been operating a few days later on the 14th, when it sank a small Portuguese sailing vessel, the Maria Jose, off Lundy Island. This was the last time anyone saw the U-boat during the Great War, but in the years that were to follow, it would arguably become one of the best known U-boats of the period, as the story of the events which supposedly had taken place while the U-boat was at sea circulated in books, magazines, and in both military and paranormal circles alike. While at first glance, UB-65's war story appears rather typical and almost unremarkable when compared to other more successful U-boats, if the stories are to be believed, then the crew on board had anything but a typical wartime experience. Before we delve into the legend of the haunted U-boat in more detail, we must first take a moment to remember that to serve in a submarine of any navy during the Great War was a courageous act in itself. The technology was still rather new, and the tactics of submarine warfare were still evolving. Often the unreliable submarines were as much of a threat to their crews as the enemy, and so it took a certain level of psychological toughness and level-headedness to volunteer for submarine duty. However, like many sailors of years gone by, superstition remained a shipmate to U-boat crews, these being portents both good and bad in nature. And as UB-65 went to war in late 1917, the crew felt overwhelmingly that they were experiencing the latter: bad omens. As if the body count already had not left them with a sense of foreboding, then the report of the sighting of the deceased second officer's ghost only left them with the feeling that their ordeal was not yet over, and that they would be taking one extra crewman to sea with them from then on. Sightings of the deceased officer were rampant on the U-boat's first patrol. Scheller was able to brush off many of these as a case of war nerves, mixed with superstition providing fuel for some overactive imaginations. He even tried to get the crew to believe that the sightings of Richter's ghost were part of a practical joke, but he was unable to firmly put the matter to rest. It was made all the worse for him when a report came down to him that the duty officer on the bridge was found sobbing uncontrollably after claiming to have seen the dead Richter walking up the gangplank onto the U-boat before stopping in front of him with his arms folded. Another man known as Eberhard became so convinced that the ghostly officer was following him through the U-boat that he had a mental breakdown and could only be calmed down after he was administered morphine. Even Scheller eventually saw the ghost of his former second officer, spying him on the prow of the U-boat just as he was about to order the submarine to dive. And as if the apparition were not enough, men were still dying around the U-boat. Having been spotted by an Allied warship, Scheller ordered the U-boat to crash dive in an effort to escape, but not before the UB-65 was subjected to a depth charge attack. During the attack, one man was knocked overboard, whereupon he broke 3 of his ribs, which caused massive internal injuries, which the crew could do little for. He died shortly after, his screams of agony filling the submarine's interior. While such an incident could happen to any U-boat crew, such was the atmosphere on board that it was again attributed to the curse that the UB-65 seemingly carried with it. Then, after an unsuccessful patrol of the Dover Straits in February 1918, UB-65 arrived in Bruges, Belgium, to dock for rest and resupply, just as British aircraft began a bombing raid. One of the U-boat officers, Oberleutnant Karl Hoenig, was reportedly decapitated by flying shrapnel as he stepped down the gangplank. His headless body was propelled backwards onto the U-boat's deck. That night, his remains were covered with a canvas shroud while the crew waited for it to be collected, when another officer and 8 other crew members all reported that they saw the second officer's ghost yet again, this time standing watch over the body. This was apparently the final straw for the crew, and soon the German Admiralty found themselves inundated with requests for transfers to other U-boats. The German Navy launched an investigation and found a crew disheveled and genuinely fearful that something paranormal was threatening their lives aboard UB-65. Therefore, in an effort to calm the men's nerves, a German naval Lutheran minister, the Reverend Franz Weber, was asked to perform an exorcism aboard the UB-65. Most likely the first ever conducted aboard a submarine. Shortly afterwards, UB-65 returned to sea, whereupon it was spotted by the US submarine L2, days before the incident concerning the Maria Jose, which would mark the last time it was seen before the submarine and its crew disappeared into history. The story of the cursed and haunted UB-65 has all the hallmarks of a classic ghost story, with only its unique setting to differentiate it from the typical haunted house affairs we have come to expect from such campfire tales. The mysterious circumstances surrounding the vessel's loss only fueled the belief in some circles that while contained within their metal shell, the crew of the UB-65 spent their final days battling with some supernatural force, and seemingly lost the struggle. It does make for an intriguing tale, and has even inspired a movie in the form of Dimension Pictures' 2002 movie, Below, although the setting was changed to an American submarine in World War II. But this of course begs the question, how much of this story is actually true? The first element of doubt springs up when you discover that the story was brought to the world's attention not by a German, but by a British-born journalist and naval theorist by the name of Hector Charles Bywater. Born into a middle-class Welsh family, Bywater emigrated to the United States with his parents when he was a child, and later made a name for himself writing articles for newspapers on the latest naval developments. This still being the age of the empires, and so interest in naval matters was high. Later, he returned to Europe to cover the war for American papers, but was eventually recruited by the British as a spy and intelligence analyst. He is, however, perhaps most famous for his uncannily accurate prediction of how the war in the Pacific with Japan would eventually play out between the United States and Imperial Japan. Bywater first brought the story of a haunted U-boat to the wider public attention after the war, claiming he first heard of the story recounted in a German pamphlet. But it has since been theorized that the origin of the story, or some variation of it, was created by him earlier as part of a psychological warfare operation directed at the crews of German U-boats, the aim of which was to have a belief that their craft could contain some spectral entity to torment them, and thus distracting them from their duties, or even forcing them to abandon their posts, maybe even surrendering, if only to get them off of their cursed vessels. This may sound rather elaborate, but in the context of the Great War U-boat menace, it is no more outlandish than some other ideas which were floated around by the Allies. Such was the unexpected shock of the effectiveness of U-boats, and how difficult it was to combat them with the technology of the day. While it is wholly possible that Bywater was inspired by a real tale of UB-65, or perhaps some other U-boat which had gained a reputation of misfortune by its crew, according to researchers George Behe and Michael Goss, who have studied the topic intensively, the story itself is the result of embellishment from retellings over the years. Even many of the names associated with the story, save for Scheller, who is a real person, have seemingly appeared out of nowhere in later accounts, or have at best been confused with real people who had little or even nothing to do with UB-65. Summing it up, the researchers said, quote, "Official documents make it extremely difficult to believe that UB-65 was haunted. The responsibility for that rumor-like legend in all its dramatic detail cannot be traced back with any certainty before Hector C. Bywater." End quote. But if the story was created by Bywater, why did he select UB-65 specifically? Was it just a random U-boat he selected from a list? Or was it the mysterious explosion witnessed by Foster and his American crew which inspired him? Indeed, UB-65's apparent demise has also inspired another legend associated with it, which has been largely overshadowed by the reports of the haunting. This legend says that the UB-65 had been selected to test some mad German scientist's new guided torpedo, and the explosion was the result of Scheller attempting to use it to attack Foster's sub, only to have it malfunction and instead turn back and strike the U-boat. This belief persisted for quite some time, and was only really put to bed when the UB-65's wreck was finally discovered by a Royal Navy survey team, and then investigated by the UK's Channel 4 for a television series called Wreck Detectives. The U-boat had no obvious signs of damage from any weapon strike, but hatches were found open, indicating that at least some of its 37 crew had attempted to escape the submarine's impending demise. While this put an end to the guided weapon theory, it only fueled the belief by some that UB-65 was a cursed boat, the lack of official documentation as outlined by Beher and Goss being attributed to a cover-up by German naval commanders in an effort to avoid embarrassment or even prevent other U-boat crews from seeing ghosts aboard their submarines. Regardless of just how much truth there really is to the story of UB-65, it still remains an enduring and entertaining mystery to be retold, both around campfires or even to new recruits aboard modern submarines, whilst on patrol beneath the depths of the world's oceans. It sits on the top of the table of maritime ghost stories, along with the Flying Dutchman, the Mary Celeste, and the Orang Medan. But while we may enjoy telling and retelling the story of Richter's ghost standing on the prow of UB-65 with his arms crossed, much to the shock of his former crew, we must also remember that the only truth we can be certain of is that 37 people did indeed die carrying out their duty for their country in a time of war, when UB-65 sank for the last time. Their names are added to the millions who perished in the great cataclysm of history, and in the end, it is there, within the bloodshed of war, that the true horror can be found.